You're listening to the Valley Current.
Do you think of the mechanism as one of causation, or do you think of it as there's some correlation among and between all these various activities at the cellular level, and we haven't really yet figured out what is the ultimate cause?
No, we know what the cause is in respect to the areas that I described. It's the activation of telomerase in cancer cells. That expression is the single most distinguishing property that distinguishes normal cells from cancer cells. That is the expression of telomerase.
Okay, but when you say immortal, I don't think you mean that in the sense of the laws of physics no longer apply to even cancer cells, right?
Well, it depends on how you define immortality. The classic example would be the HeLa cell. I don't know how many people listening to this would know HeLa cell, but it was described extensively in a book called The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. It's a cell population first initiated in 1952 by George Guy, and it is a cancer cell population derived from a human cervical carcinoma, and it has been in continuous replication since 1952. It shows no signs of stopping replicating in dozens of laboratories throughout the world, just as my normal human cell strain, WI38, which is a strain that I developed from a single bit of fetal normal lung tissue, just as that cell in every laboratory throughout the world who uses it knows that it will stop dividing after 50 doublings. So there's no, so the understanding is clear as to the cause of cancer in respect to the molecular biology that I described, in which the triggering events are either in the case of cancer cells, the expression of telomerase, which could be triggered to be expressed by radiation or viruses or other known agencies that trigger the expression of cancer. So it's no longer a mystery.
Okay, so I want to relate this for a minute, because this is a lot of interesting background about the biology of these cellular activities, to what a virus is and how you think of it in relation to cellular activity. So is a virus something that you view as a live thing, or do you view it as something quite different?
Well, it's controversial to describe viruses as either dead or alive. They're not dead in the sense that they can trigger their self-replication under proper circumstances, but in the absence, if the viruses are just sitting in a test tube, let's say, and just sitting there, then they have the potential to be alive in the sense that they can replicate themselves, if that's a criteria that you will accept as life, and I think you have to. So that viruses have the capacity to self-replicate, but only by harnessing the replicative capacity of a host cell. It's very much like the following analogy. If you go into a factory that's producing Cadillacs, and you go there in the middle of the night and you insert into the computers software that makes them develop bicycles instead of Cadillacs, then you will have a good analogy as to what viruses do. A virus penetrates a cell. The virus's RNA or DNA, that is its genetic material, will harness the DNA of a host cell and tell it not to make host cells anymore, but to make viruses from now on. So they take over the capacity of the cell's own replication machinery and turn out viruses by the thousands. So that is biologically what happens, and analogous to what I started by saying, how a bit of software could turn a plant manufacturing Cadillacs into one making bicycles. So that's the way viruses work, and whether you call them dead or alive is a bit of sophistry that might be fun to talk about, but the reality is that they can harness host cells to turn out more of themselves.
And you could think of that as the sort of normal theory that all of us want to reproduce, and a virus wants to reproduce and stay immortal or become immortal through reproduction, right? In a general sense?
Well, you can't say anything in biology wants to, because that's a teleological argument that gives purpose to a biological system that is a philosophical question and not demonstrable biologically that any entity wants to do something. So, however, the usual understanding of what life is has as one of its major evidence that it can reproduce. And there are many different ways that animals and plants reproduce. And viruses have a unique way of reproducing, although there are many parasites other than viruses that take over the machinery of host cells in order to replicate themselves.
Okay, so now tell me a little bit about how you're thinking about this COVID-19 virus.
Well, you can call it a modified influenza virus. It's part of the same family of coronaviruses, as is influenza and several others, SARS and several others. And it has the capacity to mutate. Viruses in that class seem to mutate more frequently than many other viruses whose genetic constitution is more stable, like polio viruses that exist in 3 known forms. And we don't know, to the best of my knowledge, whether there are any more than 3, which makes a vaccine against polioviruses easier, because you just have to make the vaccine work against 3 different elements instead of the viruses forming the corona class of viruses, where mutations are happening so frequently that in the case of influenza, for example, you have to make a new vaccine every year in the hopes that you know the mutational changes that occurred in the influenza virus that's going to manifest itself that coming winter, which in most cases is guesswork. usual way this is done is that the World Health Organization gets input from countries in which a new flu epidemic is occurring, and they assume that that virus composing that local epidemic will be the one that will be pervasive worldwide, and manufacturers of vaccines then begin to make vaccines against that particular mutation, because they must start many months prior to the winter in which that flu virus might express itself. And in almost all cases, they're not 100% correct in having made the vaccine against the virus that appears in the coming winter, because it was based on viruses of influenza viruses that appeared much earlier and that are therefore different. So although there must be some immunity, some cross immunity, the influenza viruses are rarely, if ever, 100% effective. In the case of the current COVID-19, that coronavirus apparently mutated into a form that seems to be more lethal than influenza, but that's still not clear, because it's often forgotten that the annual appearance of influenza in the United States, for example, causes anywhere from 20 to 40 or 50,000 deaths. Just today, the United States reached 1,000 deaths in respect to deaths caused by COVID-19. So influenza kills 20 to 50 times more people than the present COVID-19 has caused up until this time in the United States.
Well, the other observation, too, is that with the shelter in place in California and a number of other states, the traffic fatalities have probably enabled survival rates that are higher, because aren't traffic fatalities the largest cause of death when you look at how people get eliminated in the United States at an early age without health issues necessarily?
Well, I don't know what you mean by that, but I can say that in this country there are about 80 deaths per day in the United States to automobile accidents. So in 12 days in this country, we have as many deaths as we have had so far in the many months since the coronavirus appeared. So that can give you some idea of the level of hype that we see today with the coronavirus, which may or may not be justified, and the failure to see in any news media with any great frequency any expression of interest in the fact that we have 80 people dying every day in the United States on our roads.
Right. So when you think about the scenarios, when you think about what is playing out now, do you say to yourself, influenza is the best analogy, and obviously the shelter-in-place orders are a good way to stop the spread of it, and maybe that's going to continue for some time, maybe even beyond the April date that Donald Trump, our current president, has announced everyone should get back to work, almost like Easter Sunday. Everyone should follow on Monday by going back to work. That's the latest I've heard from Washington, D.C.
Well, any statement made by Trump about biology in any form whatsoever is usually absolutely wrong. And his expectation that this problem will be solved by mid-April is not only dangerous nonsense, but dangerous because of the power that presidential statements have in guiding people who are willing to accept his nonsense. And those people, unfortunately, are the least educated, and that can lead to decision making that could be very seriously wrong. But the comparison of the coronavirus with influenza is, and the separation of people is probably the only way we have at the moment to have any effect on eliminating the spread of that virus. Now, we could also do the same thing, that is what we call social separation, I think it's called. We could do the same thing back in the old days before vaccines in the case of polio or measles or mumps or any of the so-called childhood diseases that we were worried about back in the 20s and 30s and 40s, because that would work in those cases as well, by having separation and preventing the spread of those viruses causing those diseases, which we now don't have to do because we have effective vaccines. And that may hopefully happen in future years when it comes to the COVID-19 coronavirus. But at the moment, all we have is separation. And although the president seems to accept the separation of people as an effective means of shutting down the spread of the coronavirus, he doesn't at all, by example, prove the point, because whenever he addresses the American community almost on a daily basis, he's standing there on a platform inches, not feet, but only inches away from the other people on his group of experts, which is unbelievable. Absolutely unbelievable.
Yeah, the examples are not being correctly set, and I think there is now real proof that even within Congress, a number of senators and a number of aides to senators, and I guess an aide to the Pence group, and Pence is supposedly in charge of running the White House program, our vice president, has had people in his group fall to the virus. And maybe the working assumption should be everyone will eventually contract this, but only the resilient will survive. And the question really now is one of, can you be resilient, and how can you be best resilient?
Tune in next time on The Valley Current.